my mom. Gonna hang around the cabin door. No work or worry anymore. Got them what you see rich blues. And I'll stand right here and I'll say, my trip is packed to travel and I'm scratching gravel in the Blue Ridge Mountains far away. I see the window with the light. I see two heads snowy white. I hear them both recite with my one boy gone Lord tonight. Got them what you said blues, and I'll stand right here and I'll say, every day I'm counting till I climb that mountain on that what you said ridge far away.
Good morning.
Good morning.
And welcome to our Farm Day program. Last year, the Hubbardston Center School began composting all its cafeteria leftovers, as you know, and leaves and grass from the schoolyard. We planted a garden and ate carrots and salads from vegetables we had planted in our compost. Then we saved seeds from the garden to plant again this year. Everyone at the Hubbardston Center School has been involved in this project in one way or another. Dozens of student volunteers have worked on composting and in the garden, weeding, planting, harvesting. Classes have met in the garden, pulled carrots, talked about seeds, insects, and organic gardening. Teachers have helped students to prepare PowerPoint presentations on composting, to measure and graph compost pile temperatures, and to chart the weight of daily leftovers in our cafeteria. Custodians like Mr. Matt have helped clean up the occasional spill of the compost bucket. And office staff post changes, Mrs. Pearsall, every week in the schedules of student compost volunteers. And every student who waits patiently in line after lunch to hand over their tray makes a contribution to our compost and garden. Can you hear me all right? With everyone working so hard toward growing our food here, it seemed like a good idea to see where we fit in the history of people producing food in Hubbardston, the history of farming here. All of the photos you'll see in this slideshow were taken here in Hubbardston between 60 and 100 years ago. And they're all photos of farms and farm people and different farming activities. These are going to be running during the program, and whenever you want to watch, that's great, and hopefully you can watch and listen at the same time. But all of those are here in town, the same town that we live in. And some of you may have noticed out in the lobby, there are several old photographs that we've blown up and posted. How many of you have seen them already? Great. Well, all of those farms are in Hubbardston, and all of those farms and those pictures were taken 100 years ago. Back in the time when women wore long dresses, whether they were in the fields or in the house, and all the farm work was done, pretty much all of the farm work was done by hand or with animals. So I'd like to start today's program by asking each of you to close your eyes for a few minutes and imagine that you are living in Hubbardston 100 years ago. In the morning, you awaken to the sound of horses below your window. You hear their feet, their heavy feet, clomping up the drive. And as you begin to realize that it's time to get up, you also hear the sound of glass milk bottles clanking outside the back door. The farmer from your neighborhood dairy is delivering fresh milk to your family. Every neighborhood has a dairy at this time. It might be the Slade Dairy on Hale Road, or the Burnshirt Dairy on Cruise Road, or maybe Breezy Hill Dairy at the end of High Street. The milk you drink and the food you eat are produced on farms all around town. You jump out of bed to dress, and your feet feel the cold floor beneath them. But the smell of wood smoke and breakfast cooking on the cook stove warms you and draws you downstairs. In the kitchen, you bring in the milk from the back steps. Fill a bowl with hot cereal and pour the creamy, fresh milk over it. You top it off with blueberries your mother canned during the summer. During breakfast, the fire warms you and gets you ready for the walk to school. Just as every neighborhood has its dairy, every neighborhood has its own school. There are 13 schools in Hubbardston, so no one has to walk very far to get there. Today, of course, there's only one school in Hubbardston, and most of you ride a bus to school. Your families buy milk in a plastic jug from the supermarket. But there are still people farming here in Hubbardston, and there are still people who remember the way farming used to be here. I'd like to introduce some of these people to you this morning, and after the introductions, each grade will have a chance to ask our panel some of the questions you came up with to learn more about farming in Hubbardston. So at the end of the table, some of you may know Mr. Charlie Woodard. Mr. Woodard's family owned the Breezy Hill Dairy at the end of High Street, and he grew up there. Next to him is Mr. Louis Richard. Mr. Richard raised pigs in Hubbardston for 40 years on the Richard farm. And his wife told me yesterday that he started with his first pig when he was 7 years old. And got more and more as the years went by. Is that right? Next to Mr. Richard is Mrs. Karen Casey. Mrs. Casey, who was then Karen Maricanto, grew up on a farm on Mount Jefferson and lived there until she was married, and her family raised mostly chickens and sometimes strawberries. Next to Mrs. Casey is Mrs. Elaine Rodecki. Mrs. Rodecki lives in Gardner now, but she grew up on Morgan Road on the Morgan farm, where her father was farm manager. A big farm that raised vegetables and animals and eggs, just about everything. Next to Mrs. Rodecki is Mr. Gary Kangas. Mr. Kangas grew up on a family farm on Pitcherville Road, and he now lives on Parsons Road, here close to the center of town. Next to Mr. Kangas is Marcella Langer. Who prefers to be known as Sella. And Sella grew up on a very small farm in Hubbardston, milking goats and raising chickens. And she now works with Mr. Mike Fern, who couldn't be here today, at his farm on Williamsville Road, Windridge Farm. And they grow lots of different kinds of produce. They grow strawberries, greenhouse tomatoes, and they're all grown organically. Next to Sella, a lot of you, I'm sure, know Mrs. Joyce Green. Green and her family live on Old Westminster Road and raise cattle and have raised sheep, I think, in the past. And their farm is Four Sisters Farm. And next to Mrs. Green is Mr. Russell Hanola. Russell grew up on Blueberry Hill Farm and lives there still. And it was quite a running farm all through his childhood, and he still has people going there to pick your own blueberries. And finally, we have Mr. and Mrs. Collier, Andrea Collier and Tom Collier. Mr. and Mrs. Collier raised sheep on a beautiful old farm on Brigham Street, the Greenwood Farm. So from here, we'll start with our third graders. Okay, Brandon.
How many animals do you have and how long does it take you to feed all of them?
Mr. Collier?
We have currently about 50 sheep on our farm, and it takes me about an hour in the morning and probably a half an hour in the evening. But right now we also have an additional 17 lambs, and I have to feed them 4 times a day, so that's another hour each day in getting the bottles ready and going out and feeding them, and I could sure use some help. So.
Great. Thank you, Brianna.
Can you tell us how you bale hay?
We used to have a tractor, and we had a large machine which they call the hay bale. You used to have to go out in the mornings, sort of, and rake up the hay that you mowed like the day before, so it had time to dry. And you put it in windrows, and then sometimes if you got too damp, you had to tedder it, which was a machine that kind of kicked the hay up and fluffed it a little bit. And then it was time for baling. Well, the first machine we bought was kind of an experiment. Most of the time I thought I had to sit on the back of it as I drove the tractor to tie the knots that came around the bale, and it just wouldn't work. The second one we did buy, which finally worked fine. A little higher? Okay. So the second one we bought seemed to work a lot better. And we went around and you pass the hay bale over the windrows. And as you keep going around, the bale keeps pushing with a compact light. The one we had was power takeoff. Some of them came with small engines on. And it pushed the bales to the back of the baler, which flopped on the ground. Then you had to go around and pick them all up with the truck or tractor. But as of today, in the modern times, they have a kicker on the back of the baler that throws them into the trailer, which we didn't have back then. That help? Thank you.
Does anybody here remember hay being made the old-fashioned way?
I can explain farming, teach you the visual of the sickle before.
Okay, yeah.
I can quite short. My great-grandfather, he bought the farm in Hubbardston in 1894. And that was before tractors and all, so they had this thing they call the sickle. You probably recognize, like the Grim Reaper had one. Basically, they go in the field and they grab these and they cut the hay with this. And then the slow method. And then they take a rake. And they have to rake it into piles like this. And then as a kid, we at the hay wagon, we have loose hay where actually the kids will be on the ground, they scoop the hay up, and then they have to pitch us up into the wagon. And there'll be us up in the wagon, and we're taking pull the hay up into the wagon, so we keep building the pile of hay in the wagon. And then they back the wagon into the barn. They had this fork that they would stick down into the hay, and they lock it. And then the horse would pull it, and we lift the hay out of the wagon and go across the barn and dump it. So we had a lot of half the barn was full of loose hay, and the other half we had hay bales later on.
Thank you. If you notice in some of the pictures on the slideshow, most of them are pictures of hay. The ones that are pictures of haying are the old-fashioned method. Okay. Hannah.
Do you make clothing out of wool?
I can answer that. We grow our own wool from our sheep, make mittens, hats and sweaters. And this is some of our yarn that we make from the wool from the sheep.
Mrs. Collier, do you have a special kind of sheep, don't you?
We have merino sheep, which is a very fine, soft wool, so the garments that I make don't scratch you.
What were the crops grown here in Hubbardston?
Well, I can speak from experience that I know blueberries were quite a prevalent crop for quite a number of years. There were several blueberry farms, including mine, which was, I think, the last one left in Hubbardston. But there were other ones. In fact, there was one on Mount Jefferson Road that was connected with our farm, associated with it. So there was quite a few blueberries. I know that. Anyone?
Gary, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the things that were raised?
Well, my parents did organic farming, they called it, where no pesticides. They never liked to use poisons. And, one thing they did is everything they put hay mulch around all the plants because we had an abundance of hay on the farm. And the potatoes, you just barely cover them with dirt, and then you put hay, and then you peel the hay back, and there's your potatoes, organic potatoes. And so I was playing with a steam engine I built when I was 6 years old, and I set the cornfield on fire because there was all this hay mulch around there. And we lost half the corn crop that year. So my dad thinks porcupines ate it to this day.
We're from Greenwood Hill Farm, and we're the one that was down on Brigham Street. And when you had your eyes closed, I was thinking that 100 years ago, the lovely house that we were fortunate to own here in town was already 71 years old. It's 171 now. On that farm, the tax records show that they were primarily a dairy farm. But they also had goats. I saw them paying taxes on goats. They had some sheep. They had chickens. So they pretty much provided themselves, I'm sure, themselves and their neighborhood with food supplies. And they had a large garden too. In fact, the first time I went out to try to expand the yard and started mowing some weeds, I realized I was mowing through the old kitchen garden, and I was mowing over old buried rhubarb plants and a lot of very hardy things that we've dug up and transplanted and still eat off of today.
Mrs. Rodecki, can you tell the kids at all about crops that were raised on the farm that your father worked? She needs. Well, my father was manager of a farm here in Hubbardston for a family from Worcester who only lived out here in the summer. And we had very big gardens, most of the crops of which were used by the Morgan family. They had 5 children, and when they grew up, they all had their own homes on the farm. And every day, my father would go around with a station wagon full of whatever was ripe at that time to see what the family would like to use that day. So it was a wonderful life for them. But we raised all kinds of vegetables, everything that I can, you can imagine, peas and carrots and beans and cauliflower and cabbage and all the different kind of vegetables that mostly the Morgan family used, although they did sell some things too, but mostly, and also they gave away quite a bit too. And we had, they raised pumpkins and melons, and in the fall they would give, they always had a lot of pumpkins they gave to the children at Halloween time over here in Hubbardston in the center of town. The Morgan family owned about 1,000 acres of land there, but it was all, after it was sold, it was broken up into different homes. So the Como family that own it now, there's a big barn and a house there that they own. But we had all kinds of vegetables, and my father originally was mostly a dairy farmer, so he had to learn how to raise all these vegetables, and most of it was used by the Morgan family. In addition to blueberries, other berries were popular in Hubbardston. Strawberries were raised quite a bit, and strawberries are being raised again now. Can you talk a little bit about strawberries?
Well, at the farm that I work on, Windridge Farm on Williamsville Road, we grow, we have 6,000 strawberry plants right now that we raised organically. And I don't know what to say about them.
They're big.
We pick all of them. They're big, they're juicy. And organic strawberries are really good. They're a lot juicier and tastier than store-bought strawberries.
Thank you.
What kind of chores do children have on the farm, and do boys and girls do the same chores?
In my house, I only have daughters, so I can't really say if boys and girls do the same chores, but I'm sure that the boys got the nastier chores if they had the choice. And the kind of chores they do every day, of course, as Mr. Collier mentioned, we have to feed the animals. We currently have goats and a llama, and we will be getting some more beef cattle in the spring. So every morning, somebody has to go out and feed the cows and clean the barn a little bit, because, you know, during the night things happen and messes are left behind, and those have to be cleaned up. And the same thing has to happen at night. They have to go out, they'll give the cows a little bit of hay and water and make sure everything's looking all right down there in the barn. And then in the summertime, we'll be planting pumpkins, and their job is to go around and plant all the seeds, and then they'll take turns weeding on the weekends. They'll go out for a good hour at a time with a hoe and just go out and hoe those pumpkins down so you can see the plants instead of the weeds.
Well, I have two older siblings. I have a brother and a sister, and the three of us all take turns doing the chores on the farm, or we used to. And I started milking the goats when I was, I think, 6 years old, 6 or 7. And so we would take turns every morning and every night, milking the goats and feeding the goats. And in the gardens, we'd all help out too, like Joyce was saying, weeding. And I think for the most part, my brother did the same chores that my sister and I did, but sometimes he would turn the compost more and we would weed more, or he would cut down trees around the garden more and we would plant the crops more.
Because those are things he liked to do.
Right. But for the most part, it ended up being we did the same chores.
Mrs. Casey?
Yeah, I grew up on we call it a chicken farm. My dad took care of the stuff like feeding the chickens because he got up really early to take care of all that. But what we did is we took wire pails and once a day went through all the chicken coop and went through all the nests and picked up all the eggs. And that was part of our chores. It didn't matter if it was a boy or a girl. I had one brother, but we all did the same thing. As we grew up, our chores got bigger and bigger. And the other thing we would do is that when we finished picking up the eggs, we would take the pail into a room and wash them. It looked like a washing machine with no cover. You'd have to wash the pail of eggs, and then we had to grade the eggs, which means we had to separate them into different sizes. Extra large, you know, when you go to the store and you see medium eggs or jumbo eggs or little eggs, well, we had to do that on a machine and package them up so that my dad could send them away to sell them.
I had 2 brothers and 2 sisters on the farm, and basically the women did inside the house chores, cleaning and cooking, and the guys were out in the field. But we all had to weed the garden 1 hour every day before we could go play. And swimming was a big thing. We went to the beach a lot, but we had to do the hour of weeding first. Okay.
Right up. They can't hear, so we really need to put our mics right up to our faces.
So when I was 16 years old, got my first job, I knew what work was and what was expected.
I remember when I was a kid, I had to feed ducks when I was a kid. We had mallards, a big flock of them, about a dozen of them at one time. And we'd feed them grain and whatnot. And I remember I had to go down, put the grain in their trough and check for eggs. Didn't always get eggs, but we usually get a couple, 2 or 3 a day. And they were very good eating, I have to say. Very large eggs. I remember my dad was allergic to chicken eggs. And so when we got the ducks, and he tried their eggs, and he wasn't allergic to them. So he really quite enjoyed the duck eggs. And as for blueberries, I remember I had to pick quite a few blueberries when I was a kid. Of course, it's difficult for a kid to be picking berries off of a high bush. I remember that. I didn't quite have to get a stepping stool to get up to the berries, because there were some smaller bushes, but I remember they did seem quite large when I was a kid. And quite a bit daunting, you know, because usually there would be quite a bit of blueberries, and you'd look in your pail and you'd say, well, gee, this isn't filling up very fast. You'd want to look for the bushes that had the larger berries, so it wouldn't take you quite so long. In fact, I still do that today.
Thanks, Russell. Does anybody on our panel remember the blueberry camps in Hubbardston? Anybody? About 100 years ago, or maybe 100 years ago, there were a lot of people growing blueberries in Hubbardston, and there were camps in the summertime when the blueberries were ripe. Whole families would go to a blueberry farm and they would camp, and the whole families would pick blueberries all day long. The children would pick, children your ages, parents, grandparents, and then everybody would keep track of how many blueberries they picked, and that was a way that they made money. And at the end of the day, the blueberry man would come and pick up the blueberries and take them off to market, and everybody got paid, even the little kids. So why don't we have the fourth graders come up now?
How long does a chicken live?
I have no idea. As far as I was concerned as a child, they lived too long.
Well, I had one answer about how long does a chicken live. I think someone said they live until you eat them. And I think usually they get eaten before their time is up. Go ahead.
How many animals have you lost to a wolf?
How many animals have you lost to a wolf?
Well, I remember one case where a cow was going to give birth to a calf, and it came home from pasture, and the calf was missing. And we went out looking for it, and we found where something was dragged away in bear tracks on the ground. So we did lose one to a bear.
Mr. Collier.
I'm not sure that we have many wolves in this part of the country, although to say we had none would be wrong. But we have a lot of coyotes, and we do lose a lot of animals to coyotes. Now, fortunately, in the 20 years on our farm, we've only lost one. But I do know that Mr. Tatton, who lives over on Cruise Road, had sheep some years ago, and he lost 23 in one summer to coyotes. If you drive by our farm, you'll likely see a llama out there, and we use the llama to protect the sheep. And the llama chases predators away, and he does a very, very good job. So, you know, knock on the table, it's not wood, maybe some wood here. We haven't lost very many, but it's because we are vigilant all the time to try to make sure that they're not exposed to the coyotes. And there's a lot of them, and most of them in town are up closer to the center of town because that's where the garbage and pets, so you need to watch your pets a little bit.
Well, I have to concur with my colleague here that coyotes are much more of a problem. I know we lost a few. I think we lost a few ducks quite a few years ago to the coyotes and raccoons. And I think quite a bit more raccoons had a feast on our ducks than coyotes.
And I'll tell you a really short story about a chicken who was in an outdoor pen, which was very heavy, and a raccoon came around at night and couldn't get into it because it was just too heavy, but it managed to reach its paw under the cage and grab a hold of that chicken's foot and pull it, and it pulled the leg right off the chicken. And in the morning we found the chicken. She was still alive, but she only had one leg. Go ahead.
A chicken will only lay one egg a day, but not every day. So if you have 5 chickens, you're not going to get 5 eggs every day, but they only lay 1 egg a day.
Sorry. I was just going to say, younger chickens that we've had usually lay about an egg a day, sometimes not every day. And then as they get older, they lay less than an egg a day, which doesn't mean they lay half an egg. But they lay about an egg every other day, and then as they get even older, every couple of days, and that's when
they get eaten.
Yeah.
Why do pigs roll in the mud?
Why do pigs roll in the mud?
Well, pigs, Jim.
Up closer, I think.
pigs will lay in the in water, in mud, because like they don't have any sweat glands. I mean, a horse, you can make a horse run, or he'll work and he'll sweat, but a pig does not sweat. That's why they'll go and lay in the mud. But if you have, if you have a pen with dry hay, good hay, they'll lay in that. Or when you put them outdoors, if they're lucky to be enough outdoors, they'll find shade, and they'll dig where the ground is colder, fresh, a little cooler, and that's why that's why they get so dirty, because they have to lay in the mud to cool off. Okay?
So they don't have sweat glands?
They don't have sweat glands.
Thank you. Okay, grade 5. Ethan.
How can you keep the bugs from eating your plants? How can you do it without chemicals and pesticides?
I explained earlier about the organic farming where they put the hay mulch around the plants, and that seemed to keep the bugs off.
Use chickens. Chickens, not all the time, but chickens will get into your garden and eat the bugs off the plants. If you leave the chickens in there all the time unattended, sometimes they'll just eat your garden, which is not a good thing. But they will first take the bugs off the plants. So chickens can be used without using pesticides as well.
So, kids can also be used without using pesticides. My siblings and I used to get paid $1 a worm for picking tomato hornworms off tomato plants. And so that was a good motivation. Everybody wanted to pick tomato hornworms. So it protects the tomato plants. And also, as we were kind of discussing yesterday, healthy plants, bugs don't like healthy plants as much. So if you keep they tend to look for weaker plants and less healthy plants. And so if you keep your plants healthy, then it sort of helps you prevent the bugs. Prevent pests.
For the blueberry bushes, we used to spray pesticides, but that was at very least 30 years ago. It's been quite a while since we ever used them. And one of the reasons we really don't need to is because we have so many blueberry bushes. We have 5,000 of them. So that kind of helps, cut down how many plants and berries the bugs can eat. But of course, you're going to have years that there's just nothing you can do. It's like it's too damp, or it's just the right weather conditions, and they're just going to eat those berries, and you're not going to get many. I remember last year was not a very good year for the blueberries.
This doesn't really have to do with insects, but my neighbor had a garden of corn, and he was having trouble with raccoons coming in and eating his corn. And a friend of his ran a hairdressing salon, and he was told that if you put hair around the perimeter of the garden, the raccoons would smell the human hair and they would stay away from your garden. So he used to go and get bags of hair that had been cut off from people and put it around the edge of his garden, and it really did seem to work. It was surprising, but it did. And the other thing we would do, we had some Christmas trees, and we were having trouble with the deer coming and eating the new growth off the Christmas trees. And we were told if we used soap powder, like you use in your laundry to wash your laundry, and sprinkle it around the trees, then the deer wouldn't come and eat your trees. And that seemed to work too.
Dove soap too.
Dove soap?
If you hang bars of dove,
yeah.
that keeps the deer away. I'm reminded by Cella's story of a book which some of your teachers might want to read with you. It's called A Penny for 100. Penny for 100, and it takes place during World War II in a community that's probably a lot like Hubbardston during World War II, except that there were lots of potato farms. It took place in Maine, in northern Maine, and potato bugs are a real problem on potatoes, and so the children in the summer would be sent out to the fields. They didn't have video games and a lot of the things that you have today. So they went out into the fields and they picked the potato bugs off, and they got paid 1 penny for every 100 potato bugs they found. So that's not a lot of money in today's money, but maybe today it would be more like 10 cents. Okay.
How many times do you water crops in a month?
Well, that really depends on the weather, and I think that if it's hot and dry, you need to water every day. And if it's really, really hot and dry and it hasn't rained for a long time, you might need to water twice a day. And we usually would water early in the morning or late at night, because then that gives the most water to the plant before the sun dries up the water.
On the farm where I lived, we had very big gardens. We were totally dependent on the rain. Nowadays, the big farms have sprinkler systems a lot of times in the ground that they can water periodically, but at the time that we had our farm, we were just totally dependent on the rain. If it was, we had enough rain, the crops did well. If it was dry, unfortunately, we would lose some of the crops. So it was, because of the size of the garden, they were totally dependent on the rain.
We had a pond across the street from the big farm where I lived, and if things got too dry, my father had not really a very big garden, but he had strawberries, and they were a prized possession of his. We would take the tractor, and I learned how to drive it, and with big barrels on the back, and go to the pond and fill the barrels full of water and bring it up to the field, and then water each and every plant to make sure that the strawberries had enough water.
The last couple of years, the gardens I've had, my squash would get on the vine and it would rot before it was fully ripe. There was just so much water and rain that we've had that I didn't have to water it.
Stella, can you talk about the strawberries today?
When we grow the strawberries now, it's one of those things that we have too many that it would be easy to water them by hand. So instead we have what's called drip irrigation. And it's like
Hold that up. So.
it's a thin tape. It's like a tube that goes down underneath the strawberries, and it's attached to a hose. And there are tiny little holes all along the tube. And you turn on the hose, and the water very slowly drips out and waters the strawberries. And so if it gets too dry, you just turn on the drip irrigation, and all the hoses that go down under each row of strawberries go on, and they all water the strawberries. It makes it a lot easier.
What should you use to help crops grow?
I think weeding is the big thing. A lot of my garden would get choked out by weeds and the plants just wouldn't do it. So we had to be out there an hour every day weeding.
There's a lot of answers. I think weeding is certainly one of the top 5 things that I would pick. Good soil. I mean, if you make sure that you till your garden and that you put your plants into good soil. And by that I mean it should not. We have a lot of clay, so we'd like to break some of that clay up and use some organic material to go into it. So good soil, making sure that it has water, keep it weeded. You can use all kinds of fertilizers. In a town like Hubbardston, where we have a number of farms, you can usually find some decent organic composted manure. I hear tell there's some compost around the school here, is there not, that could be used as well. And those composting programs can really help you prepare the soil. It'll help reduce the number of bugs that you have. It'll help give you better growth, larger vegetables. So it's a great question. It's got a pretty complex answer that we all struggle with, I think, all the time.
When you mentioned the soil, that reminded me of a story way back when. Back about 80 years ago, when my great-grandfather first started planting blueberries, there were the wild blueberries. And they were a lot harder to take care of, and they didn't produce as much. So in the 1940s, my grandfather decided to put in cultivated blueberries, which are larger bushes. They produce a lot more. And we had a company come up and test the soil. They came up and they tested it, and they said, "You'll never be able to grow blueberries here. It's not the right soil." No, we planted them, and it's still around. So obviously, got something good in the soil that's keeping them going.
I remember your grandmother telling me the story about back probably 50 or 60 years ago, scientists coming to your farm and testing to try to figure out what made these blueberries grow the way they grew, and they couldn't really figure it out. There was some special ingredient in the soil.
Well, I think most of the crops are gone in the fall, so that's one reason they don't change color, because they're no longer there. But I think you find that they do, some of them do change color. Karen and I were talking the other day about some varieties of corn. The leaves will turn red depending on the variety. And I think that happens to a number of crops, but it's not as obvious as with the trees because they're not, you don't see them as much.
My crop of blueberries, they do change color actually. They turn like this bright crimsony red for several weeks in the fall. Until
The bushes,
the leaves on the bushes. Not the blueberries themselves, they don't turn red. That would indicate something was wrong. But the leaves themselves, they turn this bright red. It's almost like one of those fire bushes that they have, you know, that they line, used for landscaping.
beautiful, they're very beautiful. And when you see them all together, all red, it's really very nice. And when you think of a tomato, it doesn't happen in the fall as much as in the summer, in the warmer weather, but tomatoes are green to start, and of course, when we eat them, for the most part, they turn red. How many of you have ever seen a red pepper? Well, red peppers were green before they turned red. So first they're green, and then when they really ripen, you can eat them green, but then they turn red later, and they actually become much sweeter. If you've ever noticed that red peppers are sweeter than green peppers, unless they're hot. Okay, go ahead.
Are you able to grow crops during the winter?
Are you able to grow crops during the winter?
At Windridge Farm, we have a greenhouse, and in the winter, or in the fall, we plant a second crop of tomatoes, and then we heat the greenhouse in the winter so that the tomatoes can still grow. So inside the greenhouse, it's like it's summer, but it's cold outside and it's warm in the greenhouse, so you're still able to grow cold or warm weather crops in the cold weather. And it costs a lot to heat it, but you have tomatoes in the winter.
My parents, they had a farm in Pitcherville that they raised plants to sell in the spring, so you could buy tomato plants and pepper plants there in flats, a dozen. And in the fall, they sold the vegetables. But it's usually about January, they order their seeds from one of the seed companies, and they had them under lights down in the cellar. So by May, a bunch of pretty good size where they're ready to sell.
And you had a greenhouse too?
Yes.
Yeah.
Just to represent those of us who have a kind of different kind of crop, yes. We don't grow vegetables, but certainly our sheep and the crop of the wool is growing in the winter, and it's a time when we have to pay particular attention to the nutrition that we give our animals. So we have to make sure that, especially when it gets really cold, that we give them enough protein that they convert that not only to keep themselves warm, but also that they can continue to grow their wool. And certainly, speaking on behalf of some of the other agriculture in town, it's at that time in the winter when those trees are building the reservoirs of that sap that's going to come up, and it's just, I think just locally, they've just about finished now with gathering the sap for the maple syrup. So you can grow a lot of crops. I know the question was probably focused at garden crops, but certainly those of us dealing with livestock, the winter's an important growth period for us as well.
And the winter is important even for the crops, the kinds of crops that we grow here, garden crops, because it's not, you're not growing a crop, but you're letting the soil rest during the winter, and you know how you need rest, and sometimes if you don't get enough rest, you don't get enough sleep, then maybe you might get a cold or you might be sick. And it's the same way with the soil. It needs that time in the winter to just rest and kind of recuperate so that it can be strong and healthy to grow more crops in the spring. So let's have grade 6.
What type of farm machinery do you use on your farm?
What type of farm machinery do you use on your farm?
Well, I'll start. A lot. We have 2 tractors. We have a skid steer, which we use to clean the barns with. We have a farm vehicle. It's an all-purpose vehicle that we use to move grain and straw and hay around with, mainly because I got tired of falling down in the ice. We have a manure spreader. We have a snow blower, a snow plow, because we've got to not just get ourselves out, we have to make sure that when we get deep snow that we can get the animals out of the barn. So it's a pretty sizable investment in capital equipment on, I think, any active farm dealing, where you have to either tend crops or deal with animals.
When you're doing gardening, we used to have a cultivator, which was a piece of equipment that was pulled by the tractor to break up the soil in the spring to make it ready for planting. We had what was called a harrow, which then smoothed out the soil, broke up the clods and made it smoother for planting. We also had a hay rake. Charlie talked about haying, and we didn't bale hay when I was on the farm. It was again piled loose in the barn and on a truck, but they had to have a machine to turn the hay over to get it dried out before they took it into the barn. And of course the tractor was the most valuable. Well, I see you've got that question down there. I would answer that way, that the tractor is the most important vehicle because it pulled a lot of the other equipment that was used in farming.
One thing I remember as a young child, my dad worked for Comet Manufacturing up here, and he was working with some flammable chemical when he was welding, and he got burned where he almost died. That got all called to the hospital that he might not live tonight. But every farm in Hubbardston sent somebody to represent their farm to come help work our farm. And I remember all these people as a young kid, everyone doing the haying, everything, milking the cows and everything. And it was wonderful to see that community help with that sort of.
So are you saying that the neighbors were more valuable than the equipment?
Yeah, everybody came to help. And one thing I never forget is the Scott farm in Hubbardston, one time they had the North spreader broke down, and they asked my dad if they could borrow his. So when they went to return it, they called us up and said, "Be outside, I'm bringing you the North spreader back." And so what's the big deal about bringing the North spreader? They painted a hot Barbie pink when they returned it.
Blueberries, luckily, don't really need a whole lot of machinery. Just basically just to maintain them, because once they're planted and they start to get their start, they really don't need all that much machinery to work them. It's more just elbow grease and time. But I remember for a number of years, my dad had this small, very old, from the 1950s, Farmall Cub tractor. My dad, even up till about a decade ago, still used it, and that was really a big help, cutting down a lot of the brush around the blueberry bushes, but not in between. Lawnmower is one of the biggest things you need for blueberries, so that you can walk in between the rows. But as for other machinery, you do have to do a lot of pruning to blueberries. That's kind of one of their little drawbacks. You kind of can't just leave them, because once they get too tall, then they don't like to produce blueberries. So you kind of have to cut them down to about 6 inches, and then they'll come back. They'll come back in 7 years, and they'll have just as good blueberries as they did before. And so you need a pair of loppers, to lop off the excess limbs. But if they get too big, which I have to confess some of mine have, you need what's called a brush cutter, which is a lot like a weed whacker, except it's about twice the size, and instead of plastic things on the end, it has a big saw blade. And you use it just like you would a weed whacker, a little more carefully. In fact, I don't like using it on my own, just in case anything happened. But that cuts it out in the bush entirely, very, very well. The only problem is it takes 3 minutes to cut down a bush, but it takes 15 minutes to lug the bush away so that you can cut down the next one. So it takes quite a bit of time.
And how many years does it take for it to grow back?
They can start producing berries again in about 2 or 3 years, but they won't be back up to full capacity for maybe about 6 or 7. So it's a while.
I think we're going to go to the next question because we're running out of time.
What would you say is your most important piece of farm machinery?
Does everybody vote for the tractor?
Everybody's going to say tractor, but I'll just say, for those people who are in active farming, have you ever shook the hand of a farmer, someone who's been in business in farming for a long period of time? I can tell you that I spent 28 years as a pilot in the Navy, and I still have my dress gloves, and now after 20 years on the farm, the gloves do not fit my hands anymore. I think our hands are our most important tool. It's not certainly a piece of machinery in the classic sense, but if I was going to take something that is not my physical being, it would be the pair of shears that I use to either shear the wool or trim feet. I do more of that than driving my tractor, to be honest with you.
I think my parents would agree that the most important piece of equipment was child labor.
Child labor. We have a lot of that here. Okay, next question.
Do you do all your maintenance on your equipment yourself?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, that's the answer.
Farm machinery costs a lot of money. How do you know when it is worth it to spend the money or do the work by hand?
When's it worth it to spend the money or do the work by hand?
When the kids go off to college. My daughter would tell you that all the farm equipment that I have, I bought after she left the farm. The serious answer would be, it does cost a lot of money, and what we do is we look at the amount of time that it replaces. If it replaces time and how much we feel our time is worth is really how we look at that. And also, how much can we produce more and therefore bring more money in?
Okay, last question.
In your opinion, which machinery invention changed farming the most?
We're all going to say the tractor again.
I want to thank everybody here today. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for coming to share their experiences with us, and especially Mr. Gary Kangas for sharing his collection of historic photos, and Mrs. Joyce Green for all of her help with the farm artifacts and photos from the Hubbardston Historical Society. Many thanks to everyone here in school whose help has been much appreciated. Mrs. Paula, of course, Mrs. Pearsall, Mr. K.M., Ms. Bodette, Ms. Bart Raber, Mrs. Afonso, Mr. Matt. Thanks also to the Mass Cultural Council and Mass Ag in the Classroom who provided partial funding for the program, and of course to all of you students and teachers who contributed so much. Thank you very much.